Um, well, firstly, I'd just like to take the opportunity to welcome all of our attendees. Hi, and thank you for taking the time to join us, particularly into your evening. My name is Jenny Waters. I'm one of the two co-chairs of the PRCA NextGen London group. And as my day job, I'm head of internal comms at a business called Hanson Search, where I support organisations to attract brilliant internal comms talent, and I also help internal comms professionals to find opportunities and develop their careers. As some of you will know, and for those of you that don't, the NextGen group is a forum for providing information, support and advice to practicing PR and comms professionals from graduate level up to account director and the equivalent on the in-house side, of course. So tonight, I'm delighted to be hosting this event and talking about internal comms and, importantly, how to progress and develop a career in the space. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about and I believe to be really key right now, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. As we know, the pandemic changed both how businesses operate, but also employees' expectations, with people increasingly choosing to work more from home, and for companies whose purpose and whose values align with their own. And as a result, businesses need to bring in brilliant internal comms people to deliver strong and authentic communications and to help build company culture, strengthen brand identity and values, and of course to increase performance and productivity. Now, what I want to do is I'll hand over to our expert panelists in a moment to introduce themselves, but I am delighted to be joined by Billy Dunbar, who is a senior internal and change communications professional. He's worked in a number of senior roles at global and market-leading organisations, including Accenture, GSK, DLA Piper and Upfield, and he is currently communications lead at Subsea 7. I'm also joined by Lilia Bedernak, who is global head of people communications at GSK and Automotive. She previously spent 5.5 years at Nissan Europe, as well as working for leading communications agency Ketchum. So I think we should just jump right in. So for those watching, please do submit questions and comments in the chat function as we go. And we'll open up questions to the floor both during our conversation, but also afterwards as well. So guys, it'd be great to hear from each of you. I think tell us a bit about your current role and also a brief overview of the work that you do in the internal comms space. Lilia, I'll hand over to you first.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, and I'm delighted to be here this evening. So thank you everyone for joining. As Jenny says, I've worked for a number of years in communications, not always internal communications. I've done work in external communications. As you can hear, I'm from Australia, so I did a fair bit of that back home before I came over to London, and I've worked in agencies and in-house in external comms for quite some time. I can't believe it, but it's been 20 years that I've been working in the communication space. I'm not that old, but I'm getting there. And in the last say about the last 3 years, I decided to move into internal communications. I have to be honest, when I was first offered a role, which is a role in Paris to take the head of internal communications role, I was a little bit hesitant because I think for a long time before we hit the pandemic, this part of communications was seen as a little bit, second to what, PR, being a PR professional. I blame media and movies, but when I moved into internal comms, for me, it's been some of the most beneficial or self-rewarding work I've ever done in communications, because when you think about the benefit you're providing it to the person sitting next to you. So it's really tangible that we all know we go to work most of our lives, and I think that I'm helping make the lives of my colleagues a little bit better every day. So that's why I've stayed in internal communications, and I'm now global head of people communications at GSK and Automotive, which has 27,500 employees across the globe. We're in 50 countries and we have 6 tech centres. So I work across all of those different cultures, is quite diverse. and I'm really, really enjoying it. So I hope this session I can, answer some of the questions you have conversation with Billy and Jenny about the importance of this communication space, and hopefully entice some of you to stay or to join the profession. So over to you, Billy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lilia. And I just want to sort of echo what you said. Thanks everyone for joining today. And again, thanks to Jenny and the team at PRCA for organising today's event. Really looking forward to sort of sharing my experience and some insights, and hopefully they prove useful. So just a little bit about me. I have worked in communications now for 10 years. I started out working in corporate responsibility and internal communications. So the corporate responsibility side was at a law firm, and it was fantastically interesting, all about building relationships and making a change. But I was always very jealous of the people who worked 100% on internal communications, and that sort of steered my next move, where I went to another law firm, and I was doing again a hybrid role where it was internal communications and a bit of PR. And again, although I did really enjoy the PR side, I just loved the internal communication side, because I did feel it was, I like what you said earlier, it was about sort of just making everyone's sort of life at work that little bit more interesting and fun. And for me, that little bit better, making life a little bit better for our employees. I really enjoyed that element of building relationships, seeing incremental day-to-day change, and also I think sort of just, I suppose, working on a real diverse spread of content, which is what I love about internal communications. Since then, I've just worked in pure internal comms roles. I took the decision about 5 years ago to stop working sort of as a full-time employee at companies, and to take on a contractor stance. So I've probably worked on about 5 contracts now, ranging anywhere from sort of 14, 15 months to as little as sort of 4-month contracts. I love this. It suits, I think, my personality in terms of wanting to go in, really throw myself in at the deep end and meet as many people and sort of make as much change happen as quickly as possible, and then move on to the next adventure, and hopefully take on new industries and sectors. And I think sort of from my perspective, I've loved the variety of roles I've had over recent years. I've worked on sort of traditional internal comms roles, but I've also worked on sort of transformation and change programs, which have been hugely challenging for me. Learned a hell of a lot, and met some really, really talented people. And hopefully I can maybe shed some light on what the differences are, I suppose, from working in the central epicenter of comms versus sort of on the sidelines of a program or a project.
Brilliant, thank you guys. I think, firstly, what I would say is what's really clear from both of you is just the passion for the work that you do and the interest that you have in the space. I think from your opinions, or do you think we're seeing a rise of internal comms? As a kind of opening question, I suppose, whether that's partly COVID related or before that, but do you think that internal comms is kind of coming to the fore now as a comms discipline?
I can go first and then I'll chuck it over to you, but I would say yes. I think there's a few reasons for that. As you know, the workforce is more diverse in terms of location than it ever has been before. And during COVID, I think a lot of executive teams realised the importance of keeping in contact and creating a culture that's outside of the office space. And I don't think that need is going to disappear as people put their personal lives before their professional lives. And that is that pull to have sort of hybrid working. I also think that there is a lot of trust barometers out there that say, during these periods of crisis, the trust really comes from executives, and that trust needs to be cascaded directly to employees. And how do you do that? Well, you do that through internal communications. And then thirdly, as most companies always look at their bottom line, I think more and more companies are looking at the cost of attracting and retaining staff, particularly in a space where our staff can be pulled into different geographies and different industries quite easily. And that cost, I know we shouldn't say that people are a cost, because definitely people are more than that, but that cost is something where executive teams are saying, this is a big number. I mean, how do we keep retaining how do we retain our staff and attract the staff we need And then again, internal communications, or I'd say employee engagement, comes to the fore. There's a variety of different reasons. And I think even when you go on LinkedIn, you'll see that there is a huge amount of internal communications or employee engagement roles on there, more so than there were before. So I think it's a great space to be in. I think it's a great skill to have. And I think it will only keep growing with time over the next few years, as I think the pandemic will continue to affect our working environments.
I completely agree. And I think sort of from my perspective, everyone who I've spoken to in my experience has been the same. If we're being honest, I think sort of looking across the budgets of some teams and departments at big organizations that have probably gone through a reduction in budget and maybe even seen a reduction in headcount, or some of the staff get furloughed. But everyone I've spoken to, and all anecdotal feedback I've got, said that internal comms teams have not had their budgets reduced. They've had their budgets, if anything, increased. And I think sort of a high performing comms team would have really come to the fore at the start of COVID, but I think where there has been underinvestment in a internal communications team, maybe over a number of years, that would have been really evident, I think, at the start of the pandemic. I think the ability for a team, an internal comms team, to mobilize, get out some really clear messages, and plan and have a real clear communications plan at the start of the pandemic would have made such a huge difference. But I think a lot of organizations would have struggled with that if they haven't been investing in communications properly. And I think very quickly they'd have really upped the ante and sort of put that investment in. And it would have been reactive rather than proactive, but it'd have definitely, I think, made that move, because it would really be evident if an internal communications team weren't working at a high level. There'd have been a real gap, and that would have a huge knock-on effect, I think, on the workforce at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Sorry,
I think to that point, also one thing that we need to be conscious of is that the expansion of digital channels has meant that also that a lot of people in organisations aren't used to, haven't been trained in, don't know how to use digital channels to their optimum. And the last 2 years has really accelerated that digital transformation in companies. And often internal communications is at the heart of that. And Billy, you've probably seen this in your change programs, is at the heart of that sort of transformation in the, it's not only a transformation in a skill set that's required, so working really closely with HR, but also in a cultural change. So your mindset has to be slightly different when you are communicating via digital channels. So I think that's, just to pick up on that point, I think that's another area where we'll see internal communication professionals being needed to be able to assist with that digital transformation.
Yeah. And do you think, like, on that note, do you think we're seeing like better integration with internal comms, but also with other disciplines? So whether that's, external comms, whether that's with HR, whether that's with leadership, culture. I think, and a good example, if we almost try and take COVID out for a moment, would be something like Black Lives Matter, I think, where actually businesses needed to, the messages they were communicating internally needed to be similar to those that were externally communicated. And do you think as internal comms professionals, we're getting better at that integration?
I mean, I'll jump in quickly on this and I'll hand over to you, Lily, because I'm sure you have like some really strong thoughts here. I mean, from my perspective, I see it, the sense that you only want so much noise happening across your organization. And I think if there is too much noise and activity happening and hitting everyone's inboxes or hitting them with too many campaigns all at once, I think it completely sort of undermines sort of what your key priorities are as an organization. And so I think you've got to be strategic, I think, when working with and partnering with the likes of HR, the likes of L&D, the likes of cybersecurity. So you've got to make sure that your relationship with those teams is really strategic, priorities are set, there's a real clear content calendar so that everyone gets their spotlight. And I think from that perspective, that sense of there being more digital channels, more opportunities to communicate with staff, it's good in a way because it gives other teams an opportunity to have a more organic relationship with their staff. But it also seriously needs that sort of central internal communications team to guide and advise teams on how best to do that and not overwhelm their audience groups. So I think there is that element from just a noise level of building relationships and managing that. But I also think, sort of, to answer your other question around sort of maybe internal communications better partnering with the likes of maybe social and PR. I think it's something which I think all internal communications teams have probably wanted to happen for a long time, and it's probably been working really well at some organizations of creating a really strong employer brand. I'm really passionate about collaborating with PR, graduate recruitment, and going and working on the same campaigns and creating content that works across my internal channels as well as their external channels. And I think you're completely right in the sense that there seems to be a growing trend for sort of more campaigns to be working across internal PR. And I think that's a great thing, because I think a brand should be, you should be comfortable to say what you say internally, externally. Barriers and walls shouldn't be up unless they absolutely have to from a privacy and regulatory perspective. And I think it creates a stronger brand if what you say internally can be said on your LinkedIn channel, can be said on an Instagram or Facebook Live, and that your employees can ask questions and see questions asked of you by external groups as well, and clients as well. Client events, the same for me. What do you think, Lilia? I'm not sure how you say that.
Yeah, particularly with your background in external and internal, Lilia. What do you think?
I think one of the biggest plays we can have as internal communications professionals when we go into any organisation is that we need to, we don't want to be creating anything that doesn't go to a variety of different target audiences. So I see employees as one target audience, similar to what you're saying, Billy, but they now sit alongside, and unfortunately maybe it's taken some time to get there, they sit alongside the media in the sense of importance. They also sit alongside other stakeholders, investors. So whenever we're creating a campaign, it's a campaign that works across all of those different target audiences, and they're seen as the same level of importance. The only thing I would say is that we should impress upon companies that employees should come first. I mean, if you're having any sort of product launch or new campaign that's going to be delivered externally, then employees should get the news before it's delivered to those other target audiences. Now, I know some companies aren't there yet, but I believe that's the sequence of how things should be launched. And what that also means is when you can sell that into a business to say that this is the way that the campaign should be delivered, it's actually much easier to get a campaign off the ground because they can see return on investment across all of those different target audiences. It's not as segmented as it used to be. And like you say, Billy, I mean, I don't believe that anything you say internally shouldn't at some point become external. If you are really a transparent company, then you should be thinking in that vein. There are some instances where stuff needs to remain confidential internally, but once you build that trust with employees, which is where we come in, then that should be something that doesn't need to be explicitly stated all the time. So I agree. I think it works alongside. We need to do it. We need to do it for a range of different reasons, and it really helps our profession to sell it in that way to business. Yeah,
brilliant. And I'm seeing that we've already got some questions coming through. Thank you. And for anyone watching, please do feel free to jump in or write comments. Linda's asked, how are we able, or how were you able rather, to turn the heads of senior managers and really push internal comms further up the agenda? Do you find that there's any key messages or campaigns that have worked really well for you? Lily, I'll come maybe to you first.
I mean, I'm very fortunate because I'm working for a company now that employee engagement, internal communications has a seat at the board. So it's our COO, our CCO is really passionate about internal communications, and so I don't feel at the moment that I have to do a big push for internal communications campaigns and employee engagement. Now, I think one of the things, like I said at the beginning, one of the ways though, if you're in a situation where you need to bolster the importance of employee engagement or internal communications, it can be around a few different things. I think one is around attracting and retaining staff, which I've mentioned, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that. If you have trust with an organisation, trust with your employees, and you're giving them a good EVP, employee value proposition, then you should be able to attract and retain anyway. And secondly, is this thing around trust. Now, I don't believe that this is the last of the big changes that we will go through as a global community. I think there will be more changes to come, whether or not it's a pandemic or other forms of disruption. And what we need to do is we need to have trust with our employees so that when we do go through periods of issues and crisis, and in the automotive industry, it seems we're in constant state of issues and crisis, that we can pull on them to just go the extra mile when we need them to. And that's where employee engagement and internal comms can play a huge role in making sure that your business gets over the line, and that also it's there before your competitors are. So that's a big sell into a board too. So I think they're the main areas where I think you can really lift the profile of this profession internally.
And Billy, what about you? Joining in different businesses, how do you kind of keep internal comms really pushed high up the agenda?
I think for me, it's always the one thing which is constant in any industry I've worked in is that sense of understanding how your employees are sort of perceiving things. And I think employee surveys are an absolute necessity to sort of be able to really track and sort of see sort of what the sentiment levels are, what the levels are in terms of confidence in your vision, in your strategy, confidence in your employee value proposition. So what benefits are available to them, what's your health and well-being offering like, etc. So you can understand where you're performing well and where those gaps are. So I think in terms of employee communications and in your internal comms role in that, it's that sense of, I think, building trust in your audience group that when they do give you this feedback, you will hear them and that you will regularly communicate back what it is you're implementing that says you're listening. So I think that's the key part of internal comms, and that is not an internal comms initiative to run that. You're just a part of sort of the process. But I think your role in internal comms is to remind people that we've got to have transparency, and that if we are going to be pushing out surveys, we have to coach teams to say, you have to be ready to action these insights, and we have to get feedback. And as a result, if you're going to go out of a survey, let's make sure we have a sort of a plan in place to follow this up. So I think sort of the role of internal comms, I think, for sort of leadership, I think, is to give them those insights, and to make sure you're putting, I suppose, in a way, a pressure to sort of communicate out what your plans are. And I think that's where you can catch the attention of a leadership team, is to really let them know where there might be some gaps in what you're doing well and what you're not. And so for me, that's a really useful asset. I think, surveys really help.
I think to that point, just picking up on that, is the other sell-in is, how do you create conversation with your employees? I mean, like an executive board member is not going to go and speak to 27,500 people, so how do you create that conversation and that two-way engagement, so that, like you're saying, I mean, surveys are a great way to do that, but we need to create platforms so that that conversation can continue during these periods where we rely so heavily on digital platforms. And if your executives can't go out and speak to the employees, which would be a traditional form of engagement, and everyone kind of says, I know how to have a conversation, I know how to talk to someone on the line, there is definitely a need for us in this digital space to think outside the box about how we create those conversations and pick up on issues that are happening in the business, say, for example, in Thailand from London, so that we can improve the culture of the company and make the business a better place for them to work, even if we have to do that remotely. So I 100% agree that the need for measurement and the need for feedback is so important, but it has to be, we have to also go like that one step further and create those spaces for conversation.
Yeah, completely. And I suppose for those that are maybe watching, whether they are people looking to get into internal comms or maybe early internal comms professionals looking to develop their careers, in your opinion, what would you say are some of the challenges that we're facing as an industry? Billy.
In terms of sort of looking to get into internal communications, I think, to be honest, I've met graduates who've come in to internal communications whose background have been from everything from sort of maybe studying journalism, to studying media, to studying history. And so there's no sort of, I think, sort of, I mean, obviously you can sort of study communications at university. So I think sort of that ability, I think looking at the skills you need to possess to go into sort of a role in internal communications. I think you've got to show, I think, obviously, an appetite and a willingness and a love for content, not just written today. I think the ability to sort of want to produce digital content is also hugely important, more so than when I was sort of starting off in internal comms. The ability to build sort of long-term relationships, because I think long-term relationships are key. So someone who's, I think, confident about going out and meeting people, someone who can work autonomously. I think with certain teams, even at a junior level, I think you can always go in and sort of build and be trusted with relationships. Most internal communications teams aren't huge. They tend to be sort of quite thin in terms of numbers. And so I think the ability to build really strong strategic relationships is, for me, a must. Anyone coming into my team, if I'm recruiting. So I think that's a sort of key part of sort of going into communications, is having that confidence level in your content writing and your content production, but also your relationship skills. In terms of sort of some of the challenges we face, I think with internal communications I think for me, the challenge I often find is educating people, I think, about how they can best work with internal communications. I don't like to see internal communications as just a doer. And I think there is often sometimes a perception that we are the doers, and we get given almost like a brief to say, can you go and do this and run this campaign and achieve these objectives for me? I see us more as an advisor, because normally the size of the team I'm in, it's important that as an internal communicator, I'm able to advise them on how to build relationships with their audience groups, to empower them to sort of understand how best to get engagement with their audience groups and sustain that engagement, and to regularly meet with my stakeholders and see how they're doing and constantly coach them. But I think that's one of the challenges I see is everyone goes, oh, internal comms is so important now, please can you do all this for me? And then you have to sort of go, well, physically I can't. So what I can do is sort of explain how you can do this yourself. And so I think not a challenge, it's more like a healthy challenge, but it's something more of,
And Lillian, what are you seeing are some of the challenges, do you think?
I think in the industry there's a challenge around the definition of what internal communications is. I think there's internal communications which people, like you see, is very much of an execution, but there's also employee engagement, which are these big chunky projects that you see around changing culture, influencing decisions, change management projects, looking at changing habits. And so we've got there's a lot more interest in employee engagement from behavioural scientists to work out how we can change some habits of employees to improve their working conditions and to improve their mental health when they come to work. So I think that's the initial thing is, as an industry, being very clear that it's not just internal communications, and I don't say just very lightly, but this is a part of an organisation that is so necessary to ensuring its sustainability and its longevity, and that comes in that sort of, I think, in that employee engagement space. So I've worked with like a few different agencies about doing big cultural change projects, and it really is so interesting because from the discovery phase to the execution phase, you work with such a variety of different people and you learn so much. And I think that's also something about that space, is that you're constantly learning. So it feeds that desire for professionals to want to continue to know more about what they're doing. So I think that's the first thing, is just like, how do we define what we do in an industry? Because what that second challenge I keep talking about is attracting people to internal communications and employee engagement. So that definition we should all work on as a community. And secondly, like I said, I sort of fell into this to a certain extent through the opportunities I had with Nissan. I think we need to be talking more about how great it is to be in this space, having passionate people coming forward and talking about these big projects they've done to improve, the lives of the people around them. And then thirdly, when you look at external communications, there's a lot of ways to measure external communications. I mean, there are organisations like Prime that are set up where you can show a correlation between spend and articles, they're so easy to justify more investment. In internal communications, it's much more challenging because I suppose it's more soft. It's like, and I don't like using that word either, but I just can't think of anything else at the moment. You have these surveys, but even in, like, when you do an engaged survey, an employee survey, it's coming back with like, are you satisfied? It's not a numeric value. So I think those three things, it's around, you know, defining who we are as a profession. It's about attracting people through passion. And it's thirdly about showing that return on investment to our employees. And that's not new, like it's been around for a long time, but I think those are the three challenges that we have as an industry.
And just on that note, Lilia, particularly around attracting people, you know, part of, as I said, my job is chatting to talented people in the market. And I think more now than ever, I'm seeing people who maybe are coming from external comms and often from agency backgrounds saying, how do I make that leap in-house? And if I did move in-house, do you think I could do internal comms? You know, do you think it's, I mean, you've done it, but do you think it's a move that is easy to do? Do you think those skills are transferable? And how do we get businesses to be more open to that?
I think that 100%, I think they are transferable. Because when you look at that continuum of saying they're different target audiences, but it's the same campaign.
Yeah.
What can be challenging coming from external communications into internal communications is understanding the tone of voice in an organization. So you need to give yourself time to fully immerse yourself in the organization and also get access to people to just have conversation. And so I think that is, in external communications and in agency, you run 1,000,000 miles an hour because you have to. You know, you can't let a story die, or you can't get your story pitched in. You have to get it pitched in time. But in internal communications, you have to create that space to understand who you're talking to and how you should talk to them before you deliver campaigns. But I think agency is a breeding ground for extremely good internal communications professionals, because I also think that culture in agencies that is aided by, people don't know it, but they are creating a great internal communication structure just by the matter of fact of doing sort of social events or sitting down and listening or working on different clients. And I think that's 100% transferable. I would love to see more people from agencies straight into in-house internal communications.
Yeah, brilliant. And Billy, one of the things that sort of we were chatting about in preparation for this was around sort of sector expertise, and you've worked in different sectors and supported different businesses. Do you think that passion for the sort of sector that the business is within is an important part of being a good internal comms practitioner?
I think definitely to have an interest and a passion in where you're working is absolutely key. I mean, for me, I have worked in quite a range of industries. I've worked in pharmaceuticals, I've worked in sort of life sciences, I'm working at an engineering company now. And I'd be lying to you if I said sort of when I left university, I was passionate about working in every single one of those industries. But the more I have had exposure to sort of working and meeting people across these industries, the more you sort of go, I'd love to learn a little bit more about this. And I think my first contracting role going into the world of sort of pharmaceuticals, I thought it was just fascinating sort of I'd worked at that point in professional services for law firms, for Accenture. And I just absolutely loved the challenge of having to understand a new business model and to understand it well. And then I really enjoyed the challenge of understanding sort of who these different audience groups are and how do I reach them. So how do I reach people sort of who are in call centers, perhaps in India or in Romania, versus how do I sort of reach people who are sort of in a satellite office in sort of a finance team in sort of Melbourne, understanding how each different sort of industry and sector, the audience groups there digest and respond to content, I found really interesting. Yeah. I've worked with lawyers, and the way lawyers take in content is completely different to the way engineers do. Lawyers are very much about getting to the point as quickly as possible, I find, and they almost like the challenge of sort of, I suppose, being amused and sort of they like a bit of humor in their content, whereas engineers love process. It's just a part of them. They don't like to just hear the high level. They actually like you to explain and walk them through what's this actually going to practically like mean for them. So getting to understand and work with sort of different professions, I found really helpful. So for me, it's not just the sector. I do find the business model really interesting and learning that, but it's, for me, it's how do these different professions engage with your content and adapting to that. And Lily, you were saying about sort of how your audience engage with your content. For me, that's something I've really enjoyed sort of learning and adapting to over the last few years.
Lily, I know, like, in almost contrast, I know you've spent time really immersing yourself in one sector. Do you find, or several, but more recently in your kind of internal comms profession, do you find that's helped you in terms of really understanding how your audiences communicate, as Billy said, or to understand the differences in the way that people consume things?
It's kind of a hard question to answer, because I've only done this role in automotive, so I'm not sure if this would change. I mean, I have friends that work in internal communications in other industries where it's different, because in automotive you have office-based and direct workers, so there's that split between audiences, which makes it really interesting, because like you said, Billy, it's quite challenging to access people that are working on the shop floor, but essentially they're some of the most important people in the business, so that creates challenges. I mean, the automotive industry, I never set out to work. I wasn't like a child. I wasn't like a kid being, I want to work with cars. Like, that's what I want to do. I wasn't like, this is my passion. But the automotive industry is in this constant sort of like wave of issues and crisis. And what that means as a communications professional is that you get exposed to like so many different day-to-day issues that you have to deal with, and it becomes quite an exciting industry to be in. And so and that's probably why I've stayed. But I'm not sure if being in this one industry for that long has made me better at my job, or has improved the way that I do internal communications, or has made me better at communicating with direct workers. But I will let you know if I ever move out into another industry for something to compare with. Yeah.
We'll do convo round 2 and you can add in your thoughts at that point. Thank you. Just to say, anybody who's got any questions that are watching, please feel free to jump in or to ask, and we'll just start taking questions as we go. But I suppose looking ahead and thinking about the industry moving forward, what do you guys think are sort of the trends that we're seeing? We kind of touched on this at the beginning, but where do we see things moving? Or if you to say, this is the trend that I think is coming for internal comms, what would that be? Maybe start with you, Billy.
I think for me, I think that there's going to be a trend now. I think the world itself is moving towards the fact that people are wanting to hear leaders have an opinion, and they want to feel represented by their leadership. So we've had some incidents, some terrible incidents which have happened over the last 18 months in particular. We all know the sort of the tragedy and murder of George Floyd, and we've had sort of the recent events in the UK of multiple women who've been murdered. And I think online, people are now more confident, I would say, to sort of voice opinions on their own social media, and to maybe be more proactive and to have a voice which they put out to the public about these campaigns. And I think they come into the office, employees, and it would feel amiss if they didn't hear or see something where it would be the leadership at least recognizing or coming out of a position. I think it's definitely a test for leaders to be confident enough to come up with an opinion. And I think that's why being proactive and having a culture where you take inclusion and diversity and sort of anything that can create the world a better place seriously, and sustainability, all these things you have to take seriously. Otherwise it feels inauthentic when you do put out a message and you do respond. So it does have to feel authentic. So I would say to anyone working in internal comms, if you are lacking in this space, start coming up with some messages and start coming up with a plan where you put your leaders in front of some really important topics. But I do think that will be a trend we see more of, which is having to be, I think, more responsive to what's going on in the world and having an opinion. I will say on the flip side of that, it doesn't mean that a company has to do something just for the sake of doing it. And I think
Agreed.
Our leadership, when I was at DLA Piper, we have a fantastic, we had when I was there, a fantastic global co-CEO who I can say right now is one of the nicest humans I've ever worked with. He's so passionate about making the company and the world a better place. But after the events of sort of George Floyd, and you had lots of reactionary statements coming out from law firms saying, we condemn this, we condemn that. And it was very important that sort of for them, they got a message out. But it was often that sense of, it felt just like they were pushing out a statement and there wasn't much to say, a plan behind it to say, this is what we're actually doing to implement some positive change on the back. This is what we need to do better. This is where we can look at ourselves and make a difference. And I remember our global co-CEO, he didn't rush out a message and he wanted to really make sure that what he said had impact. Explained that to the company about a week later, and it was quite heartfelt. And he was sat alongside his sort of leadership team, and it felt really quite poignant. And I think a lot of people came out and said they had more respect for him. So I think that's a trend, and I think it's how you manage that trend. It has to be authentic. Yeah, that's for me.
Lilia, what about you?
I think this part of the industry will just become more human. What I mean by that is you take away the bricks and mortar of an organization, and what do you have left? You have the people that work there. I mean, it's more and more that you can bring you to a workplace. So you can be Lilia, who works at GSK and Automotive. You can also be Lilia that like lives here, has these friends, does this on the weekend. And I think those conversations are now becoming intertwined. So companies are and will continue to invest more in us as people rather than just as numbers in an organization, particularly if we're not all physically in one space. And what that means is that companies are more cognizant now, and they will be more into the future around the issues that Billy's raised, so around diversity and inclusion, but also around mental health. When I started out in communications, if I had said to someone, I got to take half a day, I'm not feeling great, I got to have a day at home just to be me, my boss would have turned around to me and said, are you joking me? Are you kidding? But now
you're not working till 9 p.m. every night.
What's wrong with you? Like, you're not a human. You don't have a life. But now I think it's much more acceptable to say, I just need some time out. And that's where I think the industry is going, is that we are treating people as people first and then as part of your organization second. And that is a very smart way to run communications internally. And that I think those companies that do that will prosper even more than their competitors, because people will stay in the company for the long term. So I think that's where we're going. And that's why I actually think I'm very, very passionate about internal communications, but that's why I think us as communicators will have more and more of a role to play in making sure we create that culture for companies so that they can have longevity into the future.
Yeah, totally. And just to say thank you so much to those that are submitting questions. I'll get started on a couple now. Lilia, this one might be best for you. Josh has said, so I'm finding that so many PR and comms roles are now looking for internal comms to be included. As someone who has only worked in-house in external comms, what would be your top tips for somebody making the switch?
Are we saying that they're asking for internal comms and external comms to be one headcount, or I mean, maybe it's not a significant point.
Yeah, I wonder if someone's a purely external comms person and either they're looking to move into a blended role or a purely internal comms role. If they don't have any internal comms experience, what tips would you suggest?
I would just say, maybe reiterating that you need to get to know an organization. So be quite clear with whatever, if you're going for an interview or you're going to speak to an employee about prospective position, just to say, you know, one of the biggest things that I will need to do is just get to know your organisation. It's not that I can't draft. I'm sure with that much external comms experience, you can draft, you have a good grasp of the written word, you're able to communicate. I mean, that's what you do, but you just do it to a different target audience at the moment. But it's about making sure that you are communicating effectively and efficiently to the employees, and you are sort of saying to that prospective employee, this is as important as a role that I was doing before, if not more important than what I was doing before. I think also one of the key skill sets you can use if you do that in external communications now is the use of digital channels. Extrapolating that into an internal communications role, particularly around the use of apps and other forms of social media platforms, is extremely important. So I would say that is also a very transferable skill, even though it might be slightly skewed. It's something that is a big selling point for when you move into internal comms.
Brilliant. I think Claire's kind of asked a similar question in that, what, for both of you, kind of what would your advice be to someone who is fairly established in a sort of senior and wide-reaching comms role and who's thinking about specialising into internal comms? How do you start to make that transition? And it's not a dissimilar question to that before, but it was just if you had anything to add.
Well, I just say, just work out what you want. Like, what kind of internal communications professional do you want to be? What kind of industry attracts you? I mean, I love working in an industry where I have office and direct workers, because it creates a challenge for me about how to communicate with different people who work in different parts of the business. I also, from a person, I like working for a global company because we have 50 different offices around the world. So I need to think how things will culturally land, which is what you do in external communications anyway. But a lot of the time, as Billy said, internal comms is quite lean. So you will actually be working across all those markets. You won't be pitching out to someone in a different market for them to pitch their local papers. You'll be pitching directly to employees. So you need to be really culturally sensitive too. I think they're sort of like, they're sort of the main points. Just work out what you want, where you want to work, where you want to get to. I never ever think having internal communications on your CV is a bad idea. I think it's a great thing to do. But also I sometimes also say this to myself, you know, if you go for a new position or you're going into a new industry, it's not the end of your life, right? So you are going, this is a period of time where you're going to learn something new about a different industry or type of communications. And it's not to say that won't take you in a different direction. It might take you back to external comms, it might take you into HR, but internal comms does open up your possibilities a lot more.
Yeah. And Billy, coming to you first, you know, I think the last year for everybody was an intense one, a difficult one at times, but, you know, for internal comms people, there was certainly a sense of relentlessness, I think, you know, just constantly thinking about what's coming next and making sure that employees were kept up to date, that leaders were supported, etc. From a kind of personal perspective, as an internal comms person, how do you look after yourself? And I think importantly, how do you make sure you look after your mental health?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the one thing I've always found sort of with internal communications is if you sort of look over, I mean, any great internal comms team and function will sort of have a very clear strategy. You'll have your sort of clear set of objectives and priorities, and it will be very much aligned to the vision of the company. But what then that will allow you to do is come up with obviously your content calendar for the year. And you'll notice this in internal comms, it's that there are peaks and troughs. And I think when you're working for sort of a global or an international organization, yes, although it might be, for instance, sort of summertime in Europe and it's therefore not summertime in Asia Pac, you will notice that there tends to be sort of quieter periods and lulls and lumps. And let's take, for instance, you're going to have a quieter January in terms of having loads and loads of noise because people are sort of just coming back. July and August do tend to be a little bit quieter for the most part of organisations. If you look at year end, whenever your year end is, if it's January or if it's sort of April, there's a bit of a quieter sort of level of noise going into that year end for most organizations. And so what you can do is identify what your peaks and troughs are. I will say from my mental health, whenever I'm going for a sort of quieter period, knowing I've got a very busy period coming up, I do like to sort of get as much done in preparation. So I'm always on the front foot. So I always find sort of making sure, just because I am in a quieter period, I don't take my foot completely off the gas. But at the same time, I do make sure I really use those periods to recharge and do set boundaries. Other things I do as well, I've learned this from a lot of colleagues who have been much more senior than me, people who I respect greatly, and who have sort of family lives which are way busier than I don't have children, some of them have had children. They've created really clear boundaries at work, and have taught me that that's okay to do that. So certain bosses of mine and leaders and people even on the board at certain companies I've known who've said, you will not get me on a Tuesday or Thursday after 6 o'clock. But the other days, you'll probably get a response from me. You're likely to get a response from me, but you will not get me on those days. So if you do need me, you should have probably planned. If it is an absolute emergency, you can get hold of me, but use that wisely. And I've taken that and I've adopted that in the sense that I really do. I make sure I sort of, I play football some evenings still. And there is no way I'm not going to play football that evening, because I've told all my colleagues around me, you will not reach me on a Wednesday after a certain point. And so I think coming up with certain boundaries is really helpful. I think making sure you really respect your rest periods is really important. The world will go on without you. No one will die. We are not doctors. And I always try and encourage people to remember that. It's just creating boundaries I find really helpful for my mental health.
Anything to add, Lilia?
This saying, isn't it? It's like, it's PR, it's not ER. Okay.
That's just what I was going to say.
Keep that in mind, all right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think just to Billy's point, like, you just practice what you preach. So if you want a culture in a company to change that looks after people's mental health and prioritizes them as people, then you need to do that yourself, and your teams will follow. So I think that's it. No one's sitting at their desk till 9 o'clock at night because they think they're going to get a promotion, because they're just sitting there waiting for work to come in. It's get your work done, get out and enjoy your life. And I think that's what we need to just do as leaders in the industry. Yeah.
And I think in turn, it probably makes us just better, more well-rounded comms people in return. Brilliant. Well, I'm conscious of time. And so, with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you, Billy and Lilia, for your time. I really appreciate it, particularly on a Wednesday evening, and for sharing your tips and insights with us. Thank you to everybody that joined and asked questions. It's great to have an interactive session, and please keep a lookout for future PRCA rather NextGen events. But PCR, that just sums
you got it.
It's a problem with acronyms.
Oh dear. Well, thank you for taking the time and for joining, and speak to you all soon.
Thanks very much, Jenny.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.